It's time for the truth. Because when it comes to university, there are two very distinct sides. On the one hand, you've got the more academic, traditional view that getting a degree is vital for getting a good job and getting a good salary. But then on the other hand, you've got the more entrepreneurial perspective that university is a bit of a scam and it's just gonna put you in debt that you just don't need. Now, as someone who has actually been to university, got a degree, had a good time, but is also now pursuing a more entrepreneurial route, learning things online, well, I feel like I don't really have a strong allegiance to either side. And so in this video, I'm gonna give you the more unbiased perspective about whether uni is worth it and whether it's right for you. In order to properly answer this, there are several sub-questions. The first of which is, do you need to go to university? And this entirely depends on what you're going to be doing afterwards. Because, for example, my brother, who's now a doctor, well, he had to go to medical school to get his degree, because you can't just do an online medical course and rock up at a hospital expecting to treat patients. And so there definitely are some career paths where having a degree is pretty vital, because it's the direct step to get into the job in the first place, like becoming a lawyer. However, I'm willing to bet that for about 80% of courses that isn't the case, and the degree isn't leading up to a direct job straight afterwards. In which case, no, you probably don't need to go to university. It's going to come down to personal preference, which we're going to talk about more in a second. But the second question we need to answer is whether university is actually worth it. Is it a scam? Well, bearing in mind that in the UK the average degree costs around £30,000 in total, if we're purely talking about whether the knowledge is worth it, whether the information you get is proportional to the cost you're paying, in my opinion the answer is a categoric no. I can only really speak in terms of the business and management degree I did, but I'm pretty certain it's the same for most degrees, that you can find most of that information online for free. And yet, despite just saying that, I definitely wouldn't call university a scam. And there's several reasons for this. The first is that, yeah, sure, there's loads of information out there on the internet, but it's in no way structured. You don't know who the reliable sources are. You don't know the order in which you should be learning things. There's no support structure around you to guide you through it and give you the things you actually need to know. Secondly, I think it's hard to put a monetary value on information because you don't actually know the long-term value that it's going to bring to you. Thirdly, it's all very well saying you're self-taught and learning it yourself, but unless you actually go to university and get a degree, you don't have that official qualification, which, when you're applying for a job, is what they're actually going to care about. Having said that, let's not pretend that's all they're going to care about. They're going to be also looking just as much at your past experience, who you are as a person, your work ethic, and all of those things. So it's just a small piece of the employment puzzle. But the fourth and most fundamental reason why I don't think university is a scam is because I actually don't think it's primarily about the learning. I think the real value actually comes from the opportunities and the experiences and the parties. And look, I've heard the argument against this point quite a few times, that of course you don't need a degree to be able to go and move to a new city and meet new people and have all these different experiences, but I think the problem is that for most people at that age, it's very unlikely they're going to do that unless they go to university and have that structured setup in place for them. And so this all leads us to the third sub-question, which is that knowing what I do now, having been through the whole process, if I could go back in time and make that decision again, would I go to university? Probably. You see, it's kind of hard because I think part of the reason I went to university is just because it seemed like the logical progression. You know, I'd been in school all my life and, you know, if you're doing well in your A-levels, you're told, yeah, you should now be applying to university. And so there kind of wasn't a huge amount of thought of all these different options at the time. And so the logical part of my brain right now is saying that, well, you know that the stuff you're going to learn at university isn't really going to help in terms of building a business, which is what I want to do right now. And yet despite that, I had such a great time, I met so many great people, and it's definitely opened other avenues for me, so I think I would still go. You know, I think university really is what you make of it. And so if you're living at home while you're doing your degree, you're not really getting the social aspect, and you're purely just going to lectures and taking exams, well, I think the return on investment is pretty poor. But if you're fully embracing university life, you're having loads of fun, but you're also going to loads of events and you're learning things and you're spending some of your time on productive things, like maybe building a side business while you're there because you've got more time to work on it, well, actually I think it can be really beneficial in the long term. Because when it comes to measuring the return on investment on the whole university experience, well, that's kind of hard to judge. And although I've kind of criticised the information that you get, immersing yourself for several years in the topic you've chosen to study, you know, it is going to help, even if the stuff you're getting isn't exactly groundbreaking or it's a bit too academic and theoretical, which is what I thought. You know, it still gets you thinking more about your topic. So definitely if I hadn't done it, I don't think I would see business quite the same way I do today. And so I'm definitely not trying to say that knowledge is useless by any means. I'm just saying if we're judging uni purely on knowledge, that's when it becomes a bit of a grey area as whether it's worth it. But when you view it as a whole, for me personally, I certainly don't regret it and I'm glad I went. But sub-question 4. What about the fees? We hear this all the time about the mountains of debt students are taking on by going to university. And this is going to vary by country, but I want to specifically address the UK because it seems like a topic that people are very misinformed about. So yes, going to university you are putting yourself into debt, but it's really not the typical debt that we think of. It's not even really a loan at all. What you really are taking on is a graduate tax. And the reason for that is because you only start paying back any of the money once you earn a certain threshold, which is above £25,000 a year. And even at that point, again, it's only a percent of your earnings, I think about 9%. So this idea that every single person who goes to uni is going to end up paying back 30, 40, 50 grand just isn't true. The vast majority don't pay the whole of the loan back or get even close to paying the whole of the loan back. I mean, if you never reach that repayment threshold because you're always on a fairly low income, well, you'll never pay a penny of the student loans back. And then after 30 years, no matter what, the debt is completely wiped. So I just really wanted to stress that this is not a typical loan. There's no impact on your credit score, there's no debt collectors going to come to your house, it's all handled automatically as part of the tax system, and it's definitely not quite as bad as some of the headlines make out. Now, I'm not saying this isn't something you should think about, I'm just saying that I hear people getting put off completely about the idea of university just because of these figures that are thrown around, and actually I don't think that's a very good reason to decide whether to go or not. You don't pay anything up front, and you only start paying it back when you can afford it. Now, just on a side note to this, I hear quite a lot about people saying, oh, it's ridiculous some of the degree titles you can get nowadays, these Mickey Mouse degrees. Ironically, doing one of those that leads to a very low-paid job actually means that you're not really going to pay much for university at all. It's the people who go and get really good degrees who then go on and make loads of money who actually end up paying back their student loans. But on this channel, we're all about living a richer life, and so that's not going to be you. You're going to make some serious money. I don't know whether you're aiming for 6 figures or 7 figures or beyond, but the point is, for you, if you are serious about making a lot of money, you really should bear in mind that you are going to pay back the fees at some point. Just don't let that be the deciding factor in whether you go or not. So, on that topic, sub-question 5. Do graduates earn more money? Well, statistically, yes. I mean, it seems that generally speaking, people who've been to university, got a degree, tend to eventually get into better jobs, and so they eventually make more money. And that kind of makes sense, right? They've spent several years educating themselves. Admittedly, a lot of that time was probably spent making pasta and poor life decisions, but they have still been improving themselves in some way. And I do really believe that when you invest in yourself, which is what university essentially is, that you're gonna see bigger returns coming back to you. But on the flip side, there are definitely plenty of people who didn't go to university and are earning way more money than most graduates. It obviously depends on the path you take, and so I think the real question you should be thinking is, what are you going to do with your degree afterwards? And so to wrap all this up, if you're sat there right now thinking, should I go to university? Well, I think the first question to ask is whether you actually really genuinely want to go for yourself. Because if someone else is pushing you to go, or you think society in general says you should go because you're going to do better in life, well, if you're not actually excited about the idea of doing it, then it probably isn't for you. You're probably better off putting that dedication into something else you actually care about. And from a business perspective, I think if you're right now thinking, I'm quite entrepreneurial, I've got some ideas of businesses I want to start, I think your best bet is just going for it. I don't think you need university to do that at all. But if you are sat there thinking that you do quite like the sound of university, then don't be put off by the people talking about crazy fees and the fact that it's a scam, because I do think there's a lot of value that you can still get out of it. And that still applies even if you are entrepreneurial and think you might want to start something of your own, because you can be thinking of ideas whilst you're at university and even start putting some of them into practice, especially because there'll be some like-minded people around, hopefully, who you can perhaps work with, or lecturers that you can learn from and get help from. So it's definitely not a case of if you go to university you can't be an entrepreneur, because actually it could be a great stepping stone to get in there and starting something, so that when you actually come out of university you've already got a side hustle that's on the go that you can then transition into your full-time job. And so after watching this video, you've now got my perspective, which is basically that you shouldn't be listening to either of the extreme sides, because there's actually a more reasonable middle ground, and that for different people university could be a good thing, but for other people it's just not really the best fit. I think the actual teaching is outdated and the education system as a whole is pretty flawed, but that's a whole separate issue. The fact is, I did have a good time at university, but of course you're going to want to go and get other people's perspectives too, so you can form your own fair and balanced judgment of it. But no matter what you decide, don't buy into this headline-grabbing idea that either option is a terrible choice, or that you're either missing out or that you're wasting all your money, because there really are pros and cons to going and not going. So it's really down to what works best for you.